Well, speaking of Steve Ditko, not Dripko, let's talk more about him. Now, Steve Ditko, co creator of Spider Man and Doctor Strange, had been in the comics business since 1953, right out of art school. Actually, cartoonist school, which he had gone to on the GI Bill. When he got out of art school and started looking for work, he got a job at the studio of Simon and Kirby, actually back in 1953, and pretty soon thereafter began his long association with Charlton Comics. Here we see his very first cover from 1954. Later, he would be involved in the attempted superhero renaissance at Charlton, and in fact was the co-creator of Captain Atom. He also started working for Atlas Comics in the mid-50s and continued to get work from them after they switched over to being Marvel, and frequently was a contributor to the science fiction-y type semi-horror magazines that Marvel was putting out, like Journey into Mystery and Amazing Adventure and so forth. In fact, usually what would happen in those books in the late 50s is you'd have the main story, the cover story, which was a Jack Kirby monster from outer space story, and then something really weird from Steve Ditko in the back part of the book. And his work became very popular with the fans. This is a splash page from one of his stories and Amazing Adventures in 1961. Well, we talked about the process of creating Spider-Man, co-creating Spider-Man, and I've kind of hinted at the fact, well, actually we looked at Stan Lee more than hinting at the fact that the two of them weren't necessarily getting along that well. In the early to mid 60s, Ditko had become a convert of sorts of the movement called Objectivism, which was created by the Russian-American novelist Ayn Rand, author of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and sort of, idolized by some people who identify as libertarians. Now, her message in her novels and in her frequent public speeches and appearances, her movement of objectivism included, a couple of things that we'll talk about. One thing that it included was, and this is the biggest part, rational self-interest, relying on reason, not on, for example, religion, but on religion and one's senses, and having self-interest. In fact, Ayn Rand was opposed to any form of altruism, viewing it as fake and counterproductive to society. She also said things like, no leaf can be completely red and completely green at the same time, nor can it be frozen and on fire at the same time. A is A, which a thing is what it is, and that's all it is. So this is a statement against moral relativism is what you might call what this is against. Moral relativism, the idea that things are complicated and there are shades of gray that can depend perhaps on circumstance or other things. No, this idea is black is black, white is white, good is good, evil is evil. There's nothing in between. And that aspect in particular seemed to have struck a chord with Steve Ditko. Now, he was already having issues with Stan Lee because, this is the Marvel style under Stan Lee, right? He'd come up with kind of a general idea of what he wanted, tell the artist would draw it, then he would come through and sort of define it somewhat with his dialogue. Well, what that means is that unlike the method used at other publishers where the writer draws out a very strict script that the artist has to follow, in this style, the artist has a lot of leeway and a lot of influence on the story and how it develops, because they basically tell the story with their pictures, right? And then the writer, usually Stan Lee at this point, comes through and puts their imprint on it as well. So Ditko wanted credit not just for the art, the pencils and inks. He wanted co-plotting credit. He wanted the books to say plotted by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, scripted by Stan Lee, pencils and inks by Steve Ditko, which, if you recall from that interview that Stan gave, he was not real amenable to that idea. I mean, he was amenable to the point that he allowed it to happen, but he complained loudly about it and implied it's going to cause sales to tank. And they argued so much over the direction the book should go that eventually they practically stopped speaking. Well, not practically, they did. They stopped speaking. Ditko would show up once a month and drop off his art. John Romita later said that the problem was that Lee and Ditko disagreed fundamentally on practically everything. They disagreed on how stories should be told, but they disagreed on character, but they also disagreed socially and culturally and politically. And Ditko was really wanting to express his convictions about objectivism on the page. And one of the things that he didn't like was the fact that they had, Peter Parker, as they had co-created him, was kind of a neurotic teenager, always questioning himself, always troubled with guilt, all that stuff, which I would argue is what made him popular and resonate with audiences. But Ditko believed that he should grow up, that he should change over the course of time to become a more steadfast and self-confident and convicted person, as someone who followed the tenets of objectivism would be. But that doesn't sell comic books, so Stan Lee wasn't that interested in that. So that's part of the problem. Eventually, by I think issue 28 or so, essentially Ditko was doing everything, and Lee was just Ditko was even leaving notes in the margin as to what the dialogue should be, and Lee was just going along with it. Well, finally, in 1966, there was a parting of the ways. Now, it was not as loudly and publicly acrimonious as the parting with Jack Kirby would be. In fact, it was kind of not with a bang but a whimper, you might say. Ditko basically said, "I quit," and left. And then no one heard from him for a while. So that's when Romita took over the pencils on The Amazing Spider-Man. Now, almost immediately, well, not almost immediately, because Ditko had still been doing work. He was a freelancer, after all. He had still been doing work for Charlton Comics all this time. He would continue working for Charlton until they went out of business in 1986. He also picked up some work from DC, starting in 1968. But in 1967, he introduced his character, Mr. A. Remember, A is A, who had a business card that was half black and half white, as in this is good and that is evil. A business card that he would leave at the scene of his vigilante actions. And this was published in an anthology book called Wit's End that was published by Wally Wood, published and edited, and it was black and white. It was essentially an early underground comic. So it didn't get sold on newsstands, so there was no need for a Comics Code Authority seal on it. Well, Mr. A was this guy in a suit and tie and fedora, dressed all in white, with a white steel mask and white steel gloves, who basically didn't have an origin story, didn't have any real motivations other than objectivism. And so he appointed himself to punish the evildoers and not to coddle them, not to look into the context of their lives, not look into their background. If you're bad, you're bad, and that's all there is to it. So stop being bad, or Mr. A may beat you to death with his steel hands or throw you off a building. Again, not Comics Code approved. After a few years of appearing sporadically, the various stories were collected, I think in 1973, in the first volume that was the collected volume that was published. The same year, 1967, he created another Charlton superhero, the Question. Now, if you look at the Question, who has this featureless mask, you'll see he's essentially the same as Mr. A. He looks the same except for the metal paraphernalia, but the same thing, suit and tie, the hat, and the featureless kind of masked face. Essentially, the Question was a Comics Code Authority approved version of Mr. A. So, I mean, the Question didn't go around like, sporadically just throwing people off buildings and stuff like that. So it was a toned down version, but essentially the same character, which would later, by the way, like all the Charlton heroes, be acquired by DC Comics. I have here at the bottom a couple of panels from an issue of The Amazing Spider-Man, when Ditko was still working on that, in which he introduced a character called the Looter, who just never really caught on as a member of Spider-Man's Enemies Club, or Rogues Gallery. That's what sometimes collections of villains are called. That comes from The Flash. So your Rogues Gallery is your arch enemies. So, people like the Green Goblin, Dr. Octopus, the Lizard, they became pretty prominent throughout the years. The Looter, not so much. So, anyway, in this panel, you can see the Looter's approaching, saying the Looter can do anything. Essentially, he finds this meteor that gives him superpowers, and then he's angry at the people who wouldn't loan him money before, so now he's taking revenge on them. And his name, the Looter, is something that comes from Ayn Rand, from a line in, I think, Atlas Shrugged, in which she wrote, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, she wrote that you should run for your life from any man who tells you that money is evil, because that is the leper bell, or warning signal, of an approaching looter. So looters were those people in Rand's worldview who said that money is bad, who were anti-capitalist. Now, Rand was from Russia. Her family were, they had white Russians and red Russians in the 19-teens, the red Russians being the communists. Her family was a part of the Russian aristocracy that barely escaped with their lives in the Russian Revolution. So, anyway, Ditko introduced that character and these other characters. He continued to work for both Marvel and DC and Charlton until they folded, all the way into the 1990s, up into his 70s. And he almost never gave any interviews. And that's because another tenet of objectivism is that your work should speak for itself. And he only gave a couple of interviews in the 50 years after he quit Amazing Spider-Man, and both of those were talking specifically and exclusively about his work. Well, here's another artist that we should talk about when we're talking about the Silver Age of Marvel, and that's Jim Steranko, who was a young man who got on at Marvel in 1966. He was trained as a graphic artist. He had done some work, some sporadic work for comics, but he had a very distinctive style, and he came by the Marvel offices to apply for a job, basically, with some sample work on Nick Fury, which Nick Fury at the time was one of the lead features in Strange Tales, and the stories were done by Lee and Kirby. Steranko, like I said, he had a very distinctive style that really stood out, and he got hired on to do Nick Fury at once, and then later he worked on other books as well. But it's the Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. books that he's best known for. First Strange Tales, and then Nick Fury's own title under Steranko, which Steranko wound up being the writer and the artist, pencils and inks. And what made his style different, and on this one today, Earth Died, Joe Sinnott did the inks. But what made Steranko stand out was, well, he had a very distinctive style in his human figures, but he also was doing stuff that no one else was doing at the time. Really pop art, almost psychedelic stuff that both stood out and was very popular with audiences. In fact, he was so popular that in a short time, he sort of vaulted to the top of the highest paid artists working at Marvel, Jack Kirby and John Buscema, and Jim Steranko, because he was selling books. And he was one of the first of this new wave of comic book artists who became almost like celebrities to the fans. Now, back in the 1940s, people were familiar with Bob Kane. They were familiar with Simon and Kirby because, they saw their names. But it was mostly younger kids reading those books. Now, comics are being pursued by people in their late teens and into their 20s. And Jim Steranko just seems like a really cool artist and a really cool guy. So Steranko, followed soon afterward by Neil Adams, whose name we've been dropping repeatedly and whom we will discuss further later, were sort of this first wave of celebrity comic book artists. Here you can see on the left from Captain America's story an example of the very surreal kind of psychedelic style of Steranko. And on the right, you see a story that appeared in this new kind of pseudo-horror title, Tower of Shadows, in the first issue that came out from Marvel in 1969, that could be quickly forgotten. Now, the guy on the left, he's the host of these tales, called Digger. He's a grave digger. You'll notice the title of the book is At the Stroke of Midnight. You'll notice it is written and illustrated by Steranko, meaning pencils and inks. Edited by Stan Lee. Lettered by Sam Rosen. Steranko may have done the colors as well. Anyway, the title of the story, At the Stroke of Midnight, that was not Steranko's title. Steranko's title was the Creeping Horror of Shadow House, or something along those. Maybe it was it the Creeping Horror or the Crawling Horror? Anyway, Stan Lee didn't like it. It's too wordy. Steranko's intent was that the title and the story were an homage to the famous legendary, really, horror writer H.P. Lovecraft. But Lee didn't. They argued. Lee wanted the title changed and simplified, and Steranko got really mad about it. And Lee went ahead, and also Lee rejected the cover that Steranko had done. And the book came out, and the editor, Stan Lee, had added just one line of dialogue in the story, something along the lines of, the guy saying, "I'm getting kind of nervous because it's almost midnight," which hadn't been in Steranko's scripted version. And Steranko just got really ticked off by all of this, got in a very loud argument with Stan Lee, and quit, saying that, if you don't like my stories the way I tell them, then you don't get my stories. So he just abruptly quit, and he wound up, for the most part, leaving comics entirely. He started doing book covers, and then he went into production design in the movies, and he actually was one of the designers on, and principally designed the look of Indiana Jones later on. And he would sporadically, from time to time, return to comics. All right, well, remember that about Steranko. He was a celebrity artist, one of the first. He had a really psychedelic style that he called Zap style. And he got mad and quit because he was going to do things his way or not at all. Now let's talk about the expansion of both Marvel and DC during the Silver Age beyond the pages of comic books. Let's start by looking at television. Now, Superman had been the star of some high-quality animated shorts that were shown in movie theaters in the early 1940s. And both Superman and Batman each had 2 movie serials that came on Saturday afternoon in the movie theaters in the 1940s. But a more modern take was introduced in 1966 with The New Adventures of Superman, followed a couple of years later by The Adventures of Batman. And by the way, the voice for Robin, the Boy Wonder, was Casey Kasem, the guy who for decades counted down America's Top 40 and also provided the voice for Shaggy on Scooby-Doo. Well, in the early 70s, a couple of more editions were made on Saturday mornings. Super Friends debuted in 1973 and ran for many years. It essentially is the Justice League, but with only 5 members, plus 2 teenage sidekicks and a dog, who were later replaced by 2 other teenage sidekicks and a monkey. And you had, as we discussed earlier, Isis and Shazam, live-action show that ran, I think, for 3 or 4 years on Saturday mornings, known as the Shazam Isis Power Hour. But by far, the biggest comic book success on the small screen came in 1966 with the classic Adam West and Burt Ward as Batman and Robin, Batman TV show, which took the country by storm and was a huge, huge hit. Now, it was very campy. It was very tongue-in-cheek. It was purposely played kind of for laughs, really. So in that way, I guess in that way it was a lot like the very campy comic books of the 50s and early 60s. That same year, there was a Green Hornet TV show, also produced on and shown on ABC and produced by Richard Dozier, the same guy that made the Batman show. So they were very, very similar in how they were made. This is the one that starred Bruce Lee as the Green Hornet's sidekick, Kato. Now, in comics at that time, the Green Hornet was appearing in Gold Key comics, not in DC Comics. However, since these 2 TV shows were on the same network and made by the same guy, Batman and Robin met the Green Hornet and Kato more than once. Now, the look of Batman on the Batman TV show used the then still relatively new, quote, new look for Batman. That was a look that was designed by Carmine Infantino in 1964 to sort of, kind of modernize the character. Julius Schwartz was concerned with sales going down, so we wanted to get rid of the Bat Dog and the Bat Mite and all the other Bat pets, and just kind of get things a little bit more serious. And the one big addition that was made was that Batman's bat had a catchy yellow circle around it. So if you see Batman with the bat without the yellow circle, you'll know that's before 1964, unless it's one of the more modern versions. All right, well, by the way, also in 1964, in the comics, they killed off Alfred. They got rid of Batwoman, and there was a Batgirl character who only appeared a few times and didn't look anything like the Batgirl that you're familiar with. And Batgirl, as Barbara Gordon, that look was designed by Infantino also, and debuted on the TV show and in the comics at around the same time. So also the TV show had Alfred as the butler, and so they had to bring him back. And they made him skinnier than they had been showing him to make him look more like the TV butler. All right. Well, DC has plenty of presence, and I mean plenty of presence, in the late 1960s on television. So does Marvel. Although their initial stuff, quality-wise, as far as the quality of the animation and production, not quite as smooth as the stuff that was coming on ABC. This was syndicated. It was a show called Marvel Superheroes, and it came on 5 days a week in syndication. And each day you had a different hero. You had Captain America, Thor, the Hulk, the Submariner, and Iron Man. And the stories were adapted straight from the comic books, and they used the art, mostly by Jack Kirby, from the comic books as kind of the springboard for the animation. And it wasn't fully animated. It was just kind of the pictures from the comic book were there and the mouths were moving. One thing that was very good about it, though, was that it introduced a theme song for each of the five. But the catchiest one was the one for Captain America. Then 1967 saw the Fantastic Four, which came on ABC, lasted for 3 seasons by Hanna-Barbera. So production values were significantly higher on this one, with character designs by Alex Toth. Some people would rank this Fantastic Four cartoon as good or maybe even better than some of the ones that followed in ensuing decades. That same year, 1967, in syndication, saw the debut of Spider-Man the cartoon, which was also higher quality animation than those Marvel superheroes, although not by a whole lot. It was kind of jerky, but it was a lot of fun, and more importantly, it had an even more awesome theme song than Captain America.
Spider-Man does whatever a spider can.
Well, if you're a comic book company and your characters have their own cartoon shows, that means you're on your way to the big time. Now, let me just point out, for example, that in the 1960s, the Charlton superheroes did not have any cartoon shows. There were no Saturday morning adventures of Judo Master Thunderbolt or the Blue Beetle. So, cartoons, you're on your way. Now, if you've got cartoons and toys, then you are in the big leagues. You're not on your way. Now, DC had that going for them from the early 1940s with Superman, right? So those classic animated shorts that showed at movie theaters, those were the early 40s. And you've got some toys here. You have a 1950 circa era slingshot toy on the left. But those on the right are from the early 1940s. You got this little metal airplane that when you twist the propeller around, Superman flips the airplane over. And lower right from, I think, 1941 or 1942, this is something every child needs, a Superman ashtray. Well, it was mainly Superman that DC was getting licensing money from, particularly in the 50s when he had his own TV show. But then in the 60s, when Batman had a TV show that was so popular, the market was just flooded with Batman toys. Although, the ones I have shown here, the one on the upper left-hand corner, the Batman piggy bank, that doesn't have the yellow circle. So that's a pre-1964 Batman toy. Point is, DC had toys, and they'd had toys for a long time. Marvel, their superheroes, basically, other than the Fantastic Four that debuted at the very end of 1961, their superheroes came out in 1962, 63, 64, and yet by 1967 you had plastic figurines of various Marvel superheroes. These were about 6-7 inches tall, and they were in cast and molded plastic, the way that toy soldiers and toy cowboys were. They came actually in a variety of different colors. For the most part, every Hulk I've ever seen was green, and every Daredevil was red. But other than that, the others could vary. Now, I had all of these when I was a kid in the 70s, and I remember my Captain America was green, and my Iron Man was red, and so was my Thor. So anyway, that could vary. They weren't posable, but you were able to play with exact representations of your favorite Marvel heroes. But if you were hankering to articulate those heroes, why, a 1972 Mego Corporation had the thing for you, a new line of 8-inch action figures called World's Greatest Superheroes, and they had the licensing deal with both Marvel and DC. So, they were the same size, they could interact together. And you'll notice they have Tarzan there. The Tarzan license was held by DC by this time. Dell used to have it. Then later, Marvel would have it, and Dark Horse. He's like Conan. He gets around. Anyway, removable clothing up to a point, unless you wanted to have gloves or something, or take a mask off. But all these things were available, and it was about an equal mix of Marvel and DC, which shows you that's significant because it shows you where kids were so far as recognition of these characters. Marvel and DC were about even. Now, they made these all through the 1970s, and eventually they had quite a lineup. They even had, very rare, right there in the middle, you'll notice, Batman and Robin in their secret identities of Bruce Wayne and Dick Grayson, and Superman as Clark Kent, and then Peter Parker. Finally, one of the last sets, these are in the order they were released, they had the rest of the Teen Titans to join Robin. They even had Conan the Barbarian, although he didn't look that barbaric, really. His hair was kind of weird. But anyway, this was something that was available. By 1975, there was a playset available from Heroes World that was advertised in all the Marvel comics. And I know that I just sort of, I dreamed of this thing. But, it was $6.95. So, that's kind of out of the average kid's price range. But a lot of kids wanted this thing. It was this paper, a cardboard basically, playset that you had the paper dolls, paper figures that would stand up, and you had the buildings, several of the buildings from the Marvel Universe. You had the Daily Bugle building, you had the Baxter building there in the back. That's the tall one. That's where the Fantastic Four headquarters is. There on the right, you've got the Avengers Mansion, and this is what jumped out at me, and apparently at a lot of other kids from that era. Doctor Strange's mysterious mansion, his Sanctum Sanctorum, which, if you've seen the Doctor Strange and Avengers movies, you should even recognize because of that very distinctive window. And included in the cardboard figures that came with this thing, why, there was a wide variety. You had Luke Cage and Shang-Chi. You had Galactus, although he was the wrong size. He should have been the same size as the buildings. And here's something that I didn't know, or I would have, I would have probably tried to go out at age 7 and get a full-time job so I could get this thing. They even had the Falcon's Falcon, plus J. Jonah Jameson. Anyway, again, point is, Marvel comics were selling well, but their licensing was catching up with DC just as much as their comic book sales were. So that shows you where Marvel was at the end of the Silver Age.